Hello, good people, and welcome To Be Encouraged with Bishop Julius C. Trimble, the podcast where we look to offer an encouraging word to an often discouraged world. I'm your co-host, Reverend Dr. Brad Miller. In today's episode of To Be Encouraged, we're focusing on mental health. Our guest is the Reverend Dr. Sarah Lund, and she has a mission that revolves around the area of mental health to share hope and healing. She's an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the United Church of Christ. She's a pastor serving churches in Brooklyn, New York, Minneapolis, and New Smyrna Beach, Florida, and is the regional minister of the Florida Conference United Church of Christ and vice president of Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. She has degrees from Trinity University, Princeton Theological Seminary and MDiv, Rutgers University, a Master of Social Work, and McCormick Theological Seminary, a D-Min. And she has received the Dell Award as a mental health educator from the United Church of Christ, and involved with several things along the area of helping serve as a mentor of disabilities and mental health justice on the regional staff of the UCC, and is the senior pastor of the First Congregational United Church of Christ in Indianapolis. In particular, in our context today, she is the author of several books: Blessed Are the Crazy, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness, Family, and the Church; Blessed Union, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness and Marriage; and the focus of our conversation today, Blessed Youth, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness with Children and Teens. You could find her at sarahgriffithlund.com, and she is the founder of Blessed Mind, LLC, which you could find at blessedmind.org. Mr. Trimble, would you help us welcome our special guest to our podcast today?
Yeah, I want to say welcome to my dear friend Sarah. We really appreciate your sharing this time with our listeners, and we just continue to try to be co-conspirators for good and grace and for getting into good trouble to make the world a better place. Thank you for your witness, particularly as we break open, pull back the curtain around mental health and our role as faith leaders in this space. Welcome.
Glad to have you with us, Sarah. And just to kind of initiate our conversation, been mentioned that you're a faith leader in churches and you're involved with getting in good trouble, as Bishop has said here. We're going to find out more about that, but let's find out a little bit about you initially. Meaning, tell us a bit about your faith story, how you came to know Christ in the first place, and how your Christian faith journey has led you now to the path of being a pastor and an author, and particularly with an advocacy regarding mental health.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be a guest on this podcast to encourage folks. And so thank you, Bishop and Brad, for this invitation. We are indeed co-conspirators for goodness and hope. And I'm, like a lot of folks, kind of have a very mixed background in faith. I was baptized as an infant as a Lutheran in the ELCA tradition. Grew up in the Disciples of Christ tradition, was confirmed there. And then in college was introduced to a more evangelical flavor of Christianity in a Bible study that was run by InterVarsity. And so my faith background really prepared me to engage in a deeper level in a personal way as I connected to Jesus as really a more intimate relationship. And so I'm grateful for the people who focus on college students in that window of time when people are really searching for meaning and connection. And that was where I got my call to be a pastor, was while I was at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas.
Well, Bishop, I know you have a connection with Sarah, and share with us a little bit about your connection, and then what kind of things would you like for us to learn about her?
Well, I think my connection with Sarah is relative to our ecumenical witness here in Greater Indianapolis, but also I really want to get into, because I know we have a limited amount of time, to her writing around in the area of mental health, particularly her more recent book, Blessed Youth. As I began to read the book, it began to evoke emotions, my own emotions, and you kind of warn the reader that this might happen. As I got into the book, I realized I said maybe this is a book better suited for a community reading. But I was so already pulled. You know, when you're in a book, it pulls you in, and you just can't stop reading. So, uh, and I'll say a little bit, Brad and Sarah. Uh, my mother-in-law lived with us for 20 years. In fact, she first came to live with us. She's gone on to heaven, Leola Young Granberry. And our children are three adult children, but our children grew up thinking everybody had a grandmother who lived with them. But they didn't know why she lived with us. They just thought everybody had a grandmother who lived with them. We kind of were raised in kind of a village environment. But while I was actually in my second year of seminary, when we were at seminary, Brad, at Garrett in Evanston, my mother-in-law had to come live with us temporarily because she had mental illness, and her mother had passed, and she was living with her mother. And when her mother passed, she couldn't stay by herself. She attempted to do that, was off her meds, and just kind of things were unraveling. And even though we had a small infant, and I was living in a small student, we were living in a small student apartment in Evanston. She had to come live with us temporarily, and then eventually she had to come live with us permanently. Once I had my full time appointment and was serving a church in North Chicago, and at that time, by that time, when we had our second child, she was living with us, and again, our three children kind of grew up with their grandmother living with them up until the last one graduated. Our youngest graduated from high school, and she lived with us because she had a mental illness. They didn't know she had a mental illness because she received excellent care and support, and as long as she was on her meds and went to her therapy sessions, and she was surrounded by church community. She was very active in the church, very active volunteer in our food ministry and so forth. And so it makes a difference when you are surrounded by support. It doesn't it doesn't take away the mental illness, but it does make a difference. And I say that by way of segue into saying, reading the book Blessed Youth this may be in your other books as well, introduced me somewhat more to some of your story about your dad, about your niece, about your own childhood, and how I think this is so true. You kind of gave an insight to what I think many American families or many of families across the globe experience, but no one ever knows about it, and no one knows about it. So I want to basically start with an open-ended question, basically around what earlier on what we read in there, both from you and from the Surgeon General around mental health is physical health. Um, Help us understand that a little bit, Sarah. Mental health being is physical health.
Thank you so much, Bishop, for sharing part of your story. That is so beautiful because it helps us realize that everybody has a story. We all have a story, and we all have mental health. The reason why we don't often talk about it is because of stigma. Stigma is shame. It keeps us silent and it isolates us. Mental illness has been stigmatized for a long time. And sometimes the faith that we grow up in might interpret mental illness as a sin, demon possession, punishment from God. And so thinking of mental illness in these ways makes us feel ashamed and reluctant to get help. So, what we're trying to do is connect mental illness and mental health to other kinds of health. And our brain is an organ, our heart is an organ. We can get heart disease, we can also get brain disease. And the more we learn about the brain, we know that it's incredibly complex, but it really is the hard drive, to our whole system. And so I ask folks when I talk about mental health, how many of you have a dentist? Everybody in the room. How often do you see the dentist? Well, to prevent cavities, we go see the dentist for good cleanings. And throughout our whole lives, we take care of our mouth and our teeth oral hygiene, right? How many of you have a therapist or a psychiatrist? A lot less people. Yet that is one of the most important parts of our body, our brain. Yet we do not have good mental health hygiene. And so I'm really trying to help folks be more open and receptive to all the ways we can proactively take care of our mental health hygiene and have a therapist. Everybody needs to have a therapist, just like you have a dentist. And so that language of mental health is part of this national conversation that just like you might bring a casserole or a hot dish over to somebody who's recovering from a heart attack or in chemotherapy, you're bringing food to the family. We want, likewise, for good folks to bring casseroles and hot dishes to people who are recovering from a hospitalization for a psychiatric illness or, depression or postpartum. That's coming out now. More and more people are willing to acknowledge that happiness with the new baby sometimes comes with lots of struggle and lack of sleep and stress. And so we can be more open about these health needs. Get a checkup from the neck up, as Patrick Kennedy
Ah,
says. Yeah.
I like that. I like. Yeah, you're the first person I heard make reference to no casserole illness.
Yes.
Say another word. Well, you just said a little bit about it, but can you expand on that? No casserole, the no casserole.
Yeah. Yeah, mental illness is called the no casserole illness. In our family, I write about in Blessed Union, our marriage, my husband sometimes will get in a pretty serious depressive episode where he's not able to get out of bed really for a few days. And so, wouldn't it be beautiful if we had the type of community where we could openly say, you know what, we're struggling. Uh, if you brought over a lasagna or, chicken, this would really help and bless our families. But we don't. I've talked to other church groups where a mom struggling to raise three kids, and two of them have mental health challenges, and her anxiety is so high. And she said it would help so much just to have someone bring over a chicken dinner. One less thing for me to worry about and give my family a nice meal. So, mental health is health helps to break down that stigma. And it's also related to this idea of parity, and you see this in our healthcare system and insurance that we don't cover medical care for mental health as we do other types of medical care. So, in the advocacy realm, we're really trying to advocate for equal treatment to equally cover with insurance anything related to mental health as you would any other kind of health disease or disorder.
Wow. Can you say something about there's good data in your book, Blessed Youth, around the impact of the pandemic and how it exposed the crisis, like the crisis of mental health, particularly with children and youth, but also what I call uh, borrowing words from your book and from Martin Luther King Jr., the fierce urgency of now. So the impact of the pandemic, what it has exposed, and why this current moment is important for not tacit advocacy, but really strong, urgent advocacy around support around mental health.
There is a fierce urgency of now. The Surgeon General issued an advisory, and this is pretty rare that the Surgeon General would do an advisory, but he did in December of 2021. And this is related to the spike in suicides in our youth. And so the data is still coming out. We're still updating it. The most recent data I read talked about 60% of teenagers are expressing feelings of depression and anxiety. And we know that depression and anxiety, if unaddressed, can lead to suicide. And so I am really hoping that churches will take this seriously and that all of us who care about children and teens will have the conversation and create a safety plan for our children. It is my conviction that everybody, no matter what your age, needs a safety plan because suicide rates are going up for all of us, even the elderly. the highest suicide rate of the general public are white men in their 70s.
Wow.
Um, yes. And the rates are going up for boys of color. And that's often not talked about. But the pressures on communities of color and the social unrest and the
Mm.
racial injustices are leading to deaths of despair. And so
Mm.
the faith community, this is where we can encourage each other because the science is also showing that as faith communities, we have a key tool to help prevent these deaths of despair. And that is the spiritual connection to God and to one another. Dr. Lisa Miller is a researcher out of Columbia University. In her new book, Awakened Brain, she has done the science and she has the data that we can prevent these deaths of despair by strengthening our spirituality. She's
Wow.
Jewish. Yeah, she is Jewish, but she says in her research that spirituality is a living relationship with a living God who is actively loving us.
That'll
And
preach.
yes, and so the more we can strengthen our living relationship with a living, loving God, and this is really what I heard you say in your story about your mother in law is that she was at church, she was surrounded by people who loved her, by you and the church. And I think that that was probably key in her recovery and in her well-being as part of her plan. In addition to a doctor, she had a pastor, she had a prayer partner. She spent time in the word and encouraged through the living relationship she had with a loving God.
Sarah, you said something I don't want to let get by, particularly for our listeners. You said a safety plan. What is a safety plan?
So, a safety plan is 3 people that we promise we will contact if we're having thoughts of despair and self harm.
Wow.
A safety plan. And there's a safety pledge in my survival guide for youth. That's a companion to the book. It's Blessed Youth Survival Guide. There's a part in that book that helps people think through okay, who are 3 people I trust? That I can tell, text or call when I am low, low, low.
Some
And
people are probably thinking, I don't have 3 people. Right now,
exactly.
somebody's saying, I can't think of 3 people. What
And
do we
that's
do,
why you need
Sarah?
a safety plan. That's why
Hmm.
we're thinking ahead of time. And if you have one person, you have one person. It really just takes one. We like to say 3 because sometimes people have their phone turned off. They're not able to get back to you in your text. So if you are surrounded by 3 people, so this survival guide is a chance to think ahead. Okay, who would my 3 people be? And tell them ahead of time. Say, hey, by the way, you're one of the 3 safeties in my life. This is what that means. And that feels good to know that there's this agreement that there are 3 people who you trust who will be there for you when you reach out to them.
Sarah, how do we equip the people in our safety plan group, as it were? I know for young people, really basically anybody, they're more likely to reach out to a friend, sometimes even a coworker or somebody like that for help, rather than a parent for a youth or an authority figure or a pastor or a teacher or something like that. They're much more likely to reach out to a peer, is the word I'm looking for, peer. So how can we help equip them in the safety group here and to help people to get this set up?
Well, the challenge with the peer connection is that it doesn't go far enough. There's a lot of pressure in peer groups to not get anyone in trouble or to make anyone mad. And when people are in crisis, there's lots of emotions and there's a sense of secrecy, don't tell anyone, and losing a friendship. So, part of the training with our youth is that we need to tell trusted adults. This is not something they can handle by themselves. And God forbid someone would die because they kept it a secret or were worried about losing a friendship. And so we tell the youth that it's better to upset your friend than to have them die.
Hmm.
And so that's why there's this idea of telling adults. and for adults to be trained. And so that's another opportunity for our faith communities, is to be the place where we have those trainings. The gold standard is Mental Health First Aid. That's a nonprofit partnering with faith communities. They come to your church, they do an 8-hour certificate training. It tells you the warning signs for someone in distress and how to respond and get help. Nationally, we have 988. So instead of calling 911 to get the police, we encourage people to call 988. It's a mental health crisis hotline. And when I train folks, we actually call 988. And when I call them, I say, I'm doing a training. We have a group of people here. Would you walk us through what you would do to help us if we were in a crisis?
So you provide a gift for me as I was reading Blessed Youth, and I really would like you to expand on it a little bit, Sarah, because this is kind of a theological word as well. Blessed, I think about the Sermon on the Mount and different translations of the word. But the word blessed, you breathe for me, you breathe new life into that word on what it means to be holy as well as whole, WHOLE, and holy, HOLY. Uh, so can you say more about what blessed? I said this a few days ago in a sermon that our sacred worth is not subject to debate. So God has already blessed us to be loved, but there's so many other voices that come in. So does the word blessed? How do you breathe that life into that as being holy and whole?
Thank you so much. Mental health is what impacts our emotions, our feelings, our behaviors, our relationships. Mental health impacts everything. And so when we are having a mental health challenge, it impacts our moods, how we think and feel about ourselves. And so oftentimes, mental illnesses will cause a low self esteem, a feeling of worthlessness, a feeling of hopelessness, despair. Part of our brain that processes mental illness is also the similar part that processes spirituality. And so, one of the side effects of it is feeling like God has abandoned us because our brains have sort of blocked that spiritual pathway. And so, people can feel utterly abandoned and forsaken by God when they are really in what I call the valleys of the shadow of mental illness. And so, in the midst of that, I want to remind myself and other folks that we are blessed. We are not cursed. We are not forsaken. As we hear Jesus say, Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who live with mental illness and their loved ones. This reminds us that we are more than our illness. We are more than our diagnosis. We are more than our label. We are more than what's broken about us. We are made in the image of God, and we are Jesus's beloved disciples, part of God's family. And so I have to remind myself, because like a lot of folks in my family, we have generations of mental health challenges. We have bipolar disorder that is genetic. So I can see 4 generations of people in my family that have bipolar disorder. And so
Wow.
someone might say, wow, is that a family curse? This just
Hmm.
keeps passed on from generation to generation. Who here sinned? And so that's just kind of always there for me, because that's so much how we talk in the Christian faith, right? Cursed and sin, it's all throughout the Bible. But really, would God do that? Would God take God's precious, beloved people and curse them with generations of bipolar disorder? Not my God. That's not a God of love and grace. My God says, you know what? You're human, you're beloved, you have a brain. Sometimes our brains are made differently. And so I like this idea of neurodiversity. We all have diversity in the ways our brains work. And when folks like your mother in law get support and help, these different brains can be beautiful, can create art, new ideas, talents. And a lot of our best thinking and original ideas come from people whose brains are different. And so that's also part of this idea of blessed, and to really focus on the beauty and the giftedness that we all have, no matter what mental health diagnosis we have or medications we take.
It's it's uh it's so important to realize that everyone has a story, and also the understanding of from birth on. We often think of people at a certain age, things being noticed or diagnosed. But in your book, you talk about even early on as infants and prenatal, some of these things are happening. I think back now on some things that, as a parent, looking back, I said, maybe we were really missing some things that were going on. Or even I think of things, language that I confess before God and all of our podcast listeners, that I think back on words that I used or thoughts that I had that really were not healthy. Like when we said, well, those are bad kids as opposed to good kids, bad behavior, and all of these things that we without thinking about it, stigmatize and label, when really our stories are maybe a lot more complex than we extend enough grace to understand. Does that make sense? I know I'm rambling a little bit, but maybe you can
No, it
help me
does
there.
make sense. Yeah. And I think, our churches can be places where that judgment comes out. So I think we all have stories of encounters at church with our kids where it's like, oh, is my kid being bad, or is my kid acting in a way that's not wanted here? And so our church has a playground. We have a space for kids to be in the sanctuary where there's no pews, there's soft pillows and carpeting. And other pastors are starting to create spaces where children can be themselves if they have ADHD or autism, that whatever way they behave, they're not being bad. They're just trying to manage all of their sensory stimulation. And so to not label kids or punish them just because their brains have them acting and thinking a little different. Too many families are staying home. They're not coming to church because they're tired of being judged or having their kids labeled or feeling rejected. And so it's
Mhm.
really a convicting moment, that there's more we can do. There's more grace and love we can show people. So to be proactive about that. So what would it look like for your faith community to have a mental health ministry where you create spaces and programming that are welcoming of youth who are neurodivergent, who have autism, who have ADHD, who have social phobias and really don't feel comfortable interacting with other people.
That is so fantastic. I hope those who are listening. The last church I served before I was elected a bishop had a mental health ministry. That only came about because lay people came to me. I was a pastor, and they educated me, and they said, Pastor, we're just missing it. There are people in our church who are hurting. They're kind of quietly dealing with things, and then we linked with NAMI and another support group and provided space for a support ministry. We highlighted Mental Health Awareness Month, and I made a public commitment to preach several times around this. But it was lay people who actually came, and parents and adults. We had one person who had been traumatized because she had been in a train wreck, and that created a whole uh, post-traumatic stress illness, and she helped lead us creating this ministry. I'm saying this because I know someone may listen to the podcast and wondering, how do you get started? This kind of leads to my next question. How do you become mental health advocates in the faith community? How do we think about? I've been to several of our churches that do have that play space, and I said, boy, I wish I would have, when I was an active pastor at the time, created space for noise in the sanctuary or in the same space, so parents wouldn't have a reason to not come to church. We would eliminate those barriers. And so, what does it mean to become mental health advocates And how does one get started? Maybe there are people hearing this, or others who work in this area, in their work in their work life, but they don't bring that to their faith space.
Thank you, Bishop, for your leadership and advocacy. Preaching about mental health makes a huge difference to break the silence from the pulpit. Because, like I said at the top of this conversation, the stigma is really the barrier that prevents people from getting help and support. So, preach about mental health. May is Mental Health Month. So, preach about it, pray about it out loud in your corporate prayer of the people. And then bring in NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They have trained volunteers who want to share their story and can share a mission moment in worship, have an educational program after church. Our church has a NAMI support group that meets here. They have family to family support groups.
Yes.
The caregivers of people with mental health challenges, they need support. There's peer to peer support groups from NAMI. NAMI's always looking for good places to meet that are safe and welcoming and inviting. Mental health first aid is another great training. In the United Church of Christ, I helped develop a whole resource called WISE, welcoming, inclusive, supportive, engaged for mental health. WISE. And it's a whole 10-step process. And a church then votes to become a WISE church. And part of that is a covenant, a beautiful promise that this church makes to be welcoming, inclusive, supportive, and engaged. And a key part of that journey to be wise is education. Learning about what is mental health, learning about what would you do if someone comes into your church in a mental health crisis. How can we love and support them? What does it mean to have a pastor who needs to go on medical leave for their mental health? What does it mean to be an advocate in Indiana as we try to pass Senate Bill 1 to fully fund mental health crisis support? How can people of faith leverage the teachings of Jesus to love our neighbor and call our senators so that they will fully fund mental health care? So it really is an exciting ministry opportunity.
Oops.
And it's also a wonderful outreach opportunity to show the love of Jesus to our community. And so, mental health ministry, if it's something that you all are interested in, I would pray that you would start the conversation. And you can read books to help get the conversation going. So, Blessed Youth has a free study guide you can find on the Chalice Press website.
Y- Speaking of youth, when we talk about peer to peer, is there a way for peers? I can think back now on our oldest son, many years ago, was really trying to be a friend to a friend who was going through a traumatic time, and came to me and asked for. And all I remember saying is, try to be the best friend you can be. I wish now, looking back, I was maybe better equipped to have to really been sensitive to what he was dealing with, because it may have been a life crisis situation. Is there peer-to-peer training? Because a lot of times the person that someone in high school or junior high might speak to might be a friend before, as Brad was saying, they would necessarily contact their parents.
Yes, so there is peer to peer training. Mental Health First Aid has a youth training. And NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, is working with schools to create these peer support groups. And we have churches who their youth group is a mental health peer support group. They
Wow, I
meet
didn't know
after
that.
school to do homework together, but they also have check ins and they check in with each other about how their mental health is doing. And so faith communities can have these mental health support groups. And like I said at the beginning, the spiritual connection to a living God, we can have spiritual support groups for mental health. And the United Church of Christ, we have a whole guideline for how to do that. My church has a spiritual support group. And what it is a safe space to check in and to pray for each other as part of our holistic care for our mental health.
Sarah, I'm going to stay United Methodist, but I sure am liking some of what the United Church of Christ is doing. So I hope you're willing to come, maybe do some of that training for some of our folks as well. We can just work across ecumenical relationships and do that.
We do have ecumenical partners. So if you look at the United Church of Christ Mental Health Network, um, it has a synagogue that has used this resource and is a wise synagogue. We have Episcopal and Presbyterian churches, and now we have nonprofits that have found this wise model. You can adapt it to your culture and context. So it really is just a beautiful model to help journey alongside people
Well,
as they.
we can't do this on our own in silos anyway. This is an epidemic, is it not, Sarah? We were talking
Yes,
about
yes.
the epidemic of suicide for one. I don't want to go off on this tangent too much, but gun violence is so often associated with mental health issues. I just noticed in a couple of the recent episodes, they're almost a weekly deal, but there was obvious social media and phone calls reaching out, basically saying, I'm going to do this because I'm ending my life and shoot some people. But my point is, you have to be in partnership with other churches, with social service agencies, with our schools, with our medical health facilities and all, because it is a crisis that we need to leverage every resource at hand. Am I correct in sharing that?
Amen. That you read my book, because that's what Blessed Youth is all about. Partnering
Yes.
families with faith communities, with schools, with mental health professionals.
Well, I
And
think
my encouragement is that the church, pastors and lay leaders, you can initiate this in your community, because there's a historic division between religion and the sciences.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of mistrust. There is this assumption that faith people just want to pray it away,
yeah,
that
Wow.
we just want the Lord to
Thought,
save us.
thoughts
So
and
they
prayers
need,
don't always cut it
yeah,
all the way, do they?
right. So they need us to initiate, say, we realize in addition to prayer and Jesus, we need doctors and therapists and social workers. So we want to invite you to partner with us.
Well,
They're waiting for that. They're
thoughts and
waiting.
prayers is one part of it, but you got to take action. You got to be
That's right.
physical. I love what you said earlier about being physically engaged. Sometimes it means intervention and other things as well, and having that going on, and that's awesome. And I'm certainly a believer in that. And it all goes back, if I'm understanding you, Sarah, to some of your personal stories about your own family, your niece, and so on. Bishop, about your mother-in-law. I've got stories in my family about borderline personality disorder that could go off on a big tangent about, but it's a very personal, but it is relevant to our whole societal health at large. And that's what I think we can do something in the church as an initiative point, whatever church we're in, and however the church can have a true impact in society through saying, okay, here we're making a stand.
And to show that encouragement through caring for each other, slowing down and asking, how is it with your soul?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
You
That's
know,
sounds a
not
little
just,
that sounds a little bit of Wesleyan, doesn't it, Bishop?
Yeah, that's a little Wesley in there.
Yeah.
So hey, Sarah, I know we're kind of running out of time, but you made reference to a book. Was it Awakening Around the Brain? And what was the name of that book and author?
Dr. Lisa Miller at Columbia University wrote the new book, The Awakened Brain.
The Awakened Brain. Okay.
It's about neuroscience and spirituality, cutting edge research, and it's very much affirming of our churches, and our whole purpose is to support people's spirituality. Little did we know that is mental health ministry.
Awesome.
Well,
Well,
friends, I would just say, even though you've heard reference to that, first book you should get is Blessed Youth. So if you get that, this should be a national bestseller. In fact, get the book. If you read it, if it doesn't bless you, I'll buy it back from you. If you can find me, if you can find me in person, I'll
there you go.
do
There you
that.
go.
I did have one final question / comment, Brad, before we bring our time together, and that was
Sure.
in the book. It makes reference, and this is very, very relevant. The role that social media has played, and I've had some discussions in my own family around the blessing of social media and technology and the multiple digital platforms, as well as I won't call it the curse, but the downside of that, and how sure we understood experienced bullying, but maybe not at this kind of level with social media. Can you say you make reference to this in the book in terms of the role social media has played in exacerbating this pandemic, if you will, epidemic of mental stress?
Yes, we need to watch very closely how our children engage online. My niece, who did die by suicide, she found the means to die on the internet. And
Gosh.
there are resources that will alert you to any searches like that. And so we always need to know, what are our children reading, listening to, who are they connecting to? Because the internet can help us as well. There was research about high school students, and it found that students with an authentic connection were less likely to have suicidal thoughts, depression, anxiety. And it didn't matter if that was an in person or online. What mattered was an authentic, caring connection. So
Mm,
the internet can give us that, but it also can harm us. And so for us as adults, we've got to monitor very closely what type of activities our kids are doing online.
One of the greatest search phrases on Google last year, right at the top two or three, was the phrase, "How can I heal?" And I think that's informative to us. And so, but in terms of our conversation here and bringing it around, Sarah, one of the things we love to do, the theme of our whole podcast here is to be encouraged. So would you share with us just a thought, an encouraging word, encouraging thought that you have to kind of help us to wrap up our conversation here today?
Well, I love Psalm 23. It's one that a lot of us hear throughout our lives. And the reason I love it is because of this promise that even though I walk through the valley of the shadows, I fear no evil, for you are with me. You comfort me. So no matter what you are going through, be encouraged. For God, who is a living, loving God, is with you through the valley of the shadows, and you will reemerge into the light of love with hope, with God's promise, and with God's love.
Thank you for sharing that. Bishop, I want you to close us on your own closing thoughts and prayer in a moment here. I just did want to say that our guest today here on To Be Encouraged is Sarah Griffith Lund, and her latest book is Blessed Youth, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness with Children and Teens. And you can find her at blessedmind.org, and it's sarahgriffithlund.com. And we'll put links to everything she is about at our website, tobeencouraged.com. Bishop, a final word of encouragement and a prayer, please.
Sometimes people are looking for a sign, and maybe this podcast might be just the sign you were looking for, that you are loved. I often say I try to explain grace in this way, using my spiritual imagination, if you will, that God has a printing press in heaven, and God is making name plates and name tags in heaven, everybody's name. And on the back of your name tag says, "You are loved." So I want everyone to know that you are loved. It's not subject to debate. It doesn't have to go before the state legislature, the U.S. Congress, or the Supreme Court. God loves you, and there's nothing you can do about it but receive that love. Psalm 71 says, "In you, O Lord, I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver us, deliver me, rescue me, incline your ear to me, save me. Be to me a rock of refuge, a strong refuge to save me." We pray that God will be your rock and that this podcast may be the sign of encouragement that you needed for today. You are loved, and in the name of Jesus, I ask blessings upon all who hear.
And we thank you for listening today to the To Be Encouraged podcast with Bishop Julius C. Trimble. I'm your co-host, Reverend Dr. Brad Miller. Until next time, friends, we encourage you to always do all the good that you can.